When Harold Mitchell's killer Tom Bradley was arrested in 2018, nobody knew that 33 years earlier, another murder had been committed in the Mitchell family. George Mitchell's 1985 tractor accident was actually cold-blooded murder. Under the same farmland lay the bodies of two brothers. One killer had been found, the other was still waiting for justice. The discovery came 6 months after Tom Bradley's conviction for Harold's murder, when Martha Mitchell finally felt strong enough to sort through decades of family documents that had been stored in the farmhouse attic since George's death in 1985. What she found would shatter everything the Mitchell family believed about George's tragic accident and reveal that their farm had been the hunting ground for a predator who had been operating undetected for over 3 decades. Martha had been avoiding the attic for months, unable to face the accumulated memories of 2 generations of Mitchell men who had died violent deaths on the same property where she had expected to grow old, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The attic held boxes of farm records, tax documents, insurance papers, and personal belongings that represented the normal business of rural life before tragedy transformed the Mitchell farm from a symbol of prosperity into a monument to unexplained violence. That if you're following cases where family tragedies span decades and the truth about seemingly random accidents reveals patterns of calculated murder, make sure you're subscribed, because what Martha Mitchell discovered in those forgotten documents would prove that sometimes the most devastating crimes are the ones that hide in plain sight, disguised as the occupational hazards of rural life. George Mitchell had been 31 years old when he died on September 22, 1985, crushed beneath his overturned tractor during what appeared to be a routine farming accident on a clear autumn morning. The official investigation had been brief and straightforward. Tractors were notoriously dangerous machines, rollovers were common causes of farm fatalities, and George's death fit the statistical patterns that defined agricultural casualties in rural Kansas during the 1980s. The funeral had been one of the largest in Millerville's history, with over 400 mourners gathering at St. Mary's Catholic Church to honor a young man who had been known for his generosity, his dedication to the family farm, and his plans to marry his longtime girlfriend Susan Patterson in the following spring. George's death had left a void in the community that went far beyond his immediate family, representing the loss of someone who embodied the values and continuity that small farming communities depend on for their survival. Harold Mitchell, then 23 years old and fresh out of agricultural college at Kansas State University, had inherited the family farm and the burden of carrying on traditions that George had been better suited to maintain. Harold was quieter than his older brother, more introspective, and less naturally gifted at the social relationships that made farming communities function effectively. The transition from younger brother to family patriarch had been difficult enough without the added trauma of George's sudden death and the financial pressures of maintaining a farming operation during a period of agricultural recession. The insurance settlement from George's accidental death had provided the Mitchell family with enough money to modernize their equipment and expand their acreage, creating the foundation for the prosperity that Harold would enjoy during the 1990s and early 2000s. The bitter irony that George's death had enabled the family's financial success was something that Harold never discussed openly, but Martha had always sensed that her husband carried guilt about benefiting from his brother's tragedy. The years following George's death had been marked by Harold's gradual transformation from a reluctant farmer into a successful agricultural businessman who managed over 2,000 acres and employed seasonal workers during harvest season. The prosperity that George's insurance settlement had made possible allowed Harold to modernize his operations, purchase additional land, and establish the Mitchell family as one of the more successful farming operations in Greene County. But the success had come with a psychological cost that Harold rarely acknowledged but which Martha had observed in his increasing isolation, his reluctance to discuss family history, and his apparent discomfort whenever George's name was mentioned in conversation. Harold had thrown himself into work with an intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun memories or perhaps guilt about circumstances he couldn't control or understand. The community's memory of George had gradually faded as newer tragedies and concerns captured public attention, but Harold had maintained George's grave site with meticulous care, visiting monthly to place fresh flowers and ensure that the headstone remained clean and properly maintained. Martha had often wondered about the intensity of Harold's devotion to his brother's memory, which seemed to go beyond normal sibling grief and suggested that Harold might be carrying knowledge or suspicions that he had never shared with anyone. The attic documents that Martha discovered in 2018 painted a different picture of George's final months, revealing details about his life that had never been shared with family members and raising questions about whether his death had been as accidental as everyone had assumed. Hidden among farm equipment warranties and tax receipts was a manila folder labeled George Personal, that contained items Harold had apparently saved but never discussed with anyone, including his wife of 28 years. The folder contained letters that George had written but never sent, addressing concerns about unnamed threats he had been receiving and mentioning his growing fear that someone was planning to harm him. The letters were dated from the summer of 1985, just months before his death, and described incidents of sabotage on the farm, equipment that had been tampered with, and encounters with individuals who seemed to be watching the Mitchell property with suspicious interest. One letter, dated August 15, 1985, was particularly disturbing. Harold, if something happens to me, you need to know that it won't be an accident. Someone has been messing with our equipment, leaving gates open so cattle get loose, and I've seen the same truck parked on County Road 12 watching our house. I don't know who's doing this or why, but I'm scared they're going to try to hurt me or Martha or the baby. I've been carrying Dad's pistol when I work alone in the back fields. The reference to Martha and the baby was confusing because Martha had been dating Harold, not George, in 1985, and she had never been pregnant during that period. Further investigation into the letters revealed that George had been secretly involved with a woman named Maria Santos, who lived in the next county and worked as a waitress at a truck stop along Interstate 70. Maria had apparently been pregnant with George's child, a situation that had created complications George was struggling to resolve in the months before his death. The discovery of George's secret relationship explained many of the tensions that had existed within the Mitchell family during the summer of 1985. Tensions that Harold had attributed to financial pressures and George's natural anxiety about his upcoming marriage to Susan Patterson. The reality was far more complex, involving a love triangle that had created enemies George hadn't anticipated and dangers he had tried to address through the unsent letters that Harold had preserved but never shared. The letters revealed that George had been planning to break up with Susan Patterson and marry Maria Santos. Despite the significant social and financial consequences this decision would have created in the conservative farming community where the Mitchell family had deep roots. George's parents had strongly disapproved of Maria, whom they considered unsuitable for their son due to her Hispanic background, her working-class status, and what they perceived as her inappropriate relationship with a man who was already engaged to someone else. George's struggle with his family's expectations and his genuine feelings for Maria had created a psychological pressure that was evident in his increasingly desperate attempts to find a solution that would satisfy everyone involved. The letters showed a man who was trying to do the right thing by multiple people who had competing claims on his loyalty and affection, while simultaneously dealing with mysterious threats that he couldn't identify or understand. The family conflict over George's relationship with Maria had escalated during the summer of 1985, with George's father Robert threatening to disinherit him if he went through with his plan to marry Maria and raise their child together. The pressure from his family, combined with the mysterious threats and equipment sabotage that George described in his letters, had created a level of stress that might have made him more vulnerable to accidents or made him a target for violence from people who opposed his relationship choices. Harold's decision to save George's letters but never act on their contents or share them with law enforcement suggested that he might have suspected his brother's death wasn't accidental but had been unable or unwilling to pursue an investigation that could have exposed family secrets and complicated the insurance settlement that had enabled the farm's survival during a difficult economic period. The psychological burden of carrying this knowledge for 33 years had clearly affected Harold in ways that Martha was only beginning to understand as she processed the implications of the letters and their connection to both brothers' deaths. Harold had lived with the suspicion that George had been murdered while being unable to prove it or do anything about it, a burden that might have contributed to the depression and anxiety that had marked Harold's later years. Martha's discovery of George's secret correspondence prompted her to contact Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who had worked Harold's case and maintained an interest in unsolved crimes that might be connected to the Mitchell family's history of violence. Rodriguez agreed to review George's death investigation, understanding that patterns of violence often extend across generations and that seemingly unrelated crimes might share common perpetrators or motives. Rodriguez's initial review of the case file from 1985 revealed a competent but limited investigation that had been hampered by the technological and forensic limitations of rural law enforcement during that era. Sheriff Douglas Walsh had documented the scene thoroughly, interviewed family members and potential witnesses, and consulted with agricultural safety experts about the likelihood of the type of accident that appeared to have killed George. But the investigation had been conducted under the assumption that George's death was accidental, which had shaped the questions asked and the evidence collected. The letters that Harold had hidden revealed that George had been expecting trouble and had taken precautions to protect himself, information that would have dramatically altered the focus of the original investigation if it had been available to Sheriff Walsh and his deputies. The original investigation files from 1985 were minimal, reflecting the limited resources and forensic capabilities available to rural law enforcement agencies during that era. Sheriff Douglas Walsh had conducted a competent but brief investigation, interviewing family members, examining the accident scene, and reviewing George's medical history for any conditions that might have contributed to the rollover. The investigation had concluded that George had been driving too fast while turning at the end of a crop row, causing the tractor to tip over and crush him beneath its weight. But Detective Rodriguez's review of the case file with modern investigative techniques revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked in 1985. The position of George's body relative to the overturned tractor didn't match the expected pattern for a typical rollover accident. The damage to the tractor itself suggested that it had been deliberately overturned rather than tipping naturally during a turn. Most significantly, the medical examiner's report from 1985, when reviewed by a modern forensic pathologist, revealed injuries that were inconsistent with the reported cause of death. The 1985 crime scene photographs, when enhanced using digital technology that hadn't existed when they were taken, revealed details that had been invisible to investigators using the naked eye or basic magnification. Tire tracks near the accident site showed evidence of a second vehicle that had been present when George died, tracks that had been dismissed in 1985 as belonging to emergency responders but which showed characteristics suggesting they had been made before George's death rather than after it. Dr. Patricia Chin, the forensic pathologist who reviewed George's autopsy records, noted that George had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his skull that occurred before the tractor rollover, not as a result of it. The pattern of injuries suggested that George had been struck with a heavy object, rendered unconscious, and then placed beneath the tractor before it was overturned to create the appearance of an accident. The original medical examiner had missed these details due to limited training in forensic pathology and the assumption that farm accidents were common and rarely suspicious. The forensic evidence that had been overlooked in 1985 painted a clear picture of premeditated murder disguised as an occupational accident. The positioning of George's body, the nature of his injuries, the condition of the tractor, and the presence of tire tracks from an unknown vehicle all pointed to a carefully staged crime scene designed to fool investigators who were expecting to find evidence of an accident rather than evidence of homicide. The exhumation of George Mitchell's body in November 2018 provided the physical evidence needed to confirm that his death had been murder rather than accident. The forensic examination revealed not only the blunt force trauma that Dr. Chin had identified in the autopsy records but also trace evidence that had been preserved by the embalming process and the Illinois clay soil where George had been buried. Microscopic analysis of George's clothing revealed fibers that didn't match any materials found on the Mitchell farm, suggesting that his attacker had worn clothing that left trace evidence during the assault. More significantly, DNA analysis of material found under George's fingernails showed that he had fought his attacker, leaving genetic evidence that could potentially identify his killer if the perpetrator's DNA was in law enforcement databases. The preservation of genetic material for 33 years was remarkable but not unprecedented, particularly given the protection provided by embalming chemicals and the stable underground environment where George had been buried. The DNA extraction techniques used in 2018 were sophisticated enough to work with degraded genetic material that would have been impossible to analyze using the technology available when George died. The DNA profile from George's case was compared against the genetic evidence that had been used to convict Tom Bradley for Harold's murder, revealing a perfect match that stunned investigators and provided the connection between two crimes that had been separated by 33 years. Tom Bradley hadn't just killed Harold Mitchell in 2018, he had also murdered Harold's brother George in 1985, making him responsible for destroying the Mitchell family across more than 3 decades. The revelation that both Mitchell brothers had been killed by the same person transformed the entire understanding of the crimes and revealed a level of calculation and patience that was almost unprecedented in criminal behavior. Bradley had committed his first murder at age 19, successfully concealed it for 33 years while living in the same community as his victim's family, and then committed a second murder using similar methods when circumstances again made violence seem attractive to him. Detective Rodriguez's investigation into Tom Bradley's background revealed that he had been 19 years old in 1985, already displaying the antisocial behavior and violent tendencies that would characterize his adult life. Bradley had been working as a farmhand for various agricultural operations in the area, moving from job to job as his employers discovered his tendency toward theft, violence, and inappropriate behavior toward women. His familiarity with farm equipment and agricultural routines had given him the knowledge needed to stage George's death as a convincing accident. Bradley's employment history during 1985 showed that he had worked for several farms in the area during the months leading up to George's death, including a brief stint with the Peterson farm that bordered the Mitchell property. His access to the area and his knowledge of the Mitchell family's routines had provided him with opportunities to conduct the surveillance and sabotage that George had described in his letters, activities that had escalated into murder when Bradley's other plans failed to produce the desired result. The motive for George's murder emerged from Bradley's obsession with Maria Santos, who had rejected his aggressive romantic advances in favor of her relationship with George Mitchell. Bradley had been stalking Maria for months, following her to and from work, appearing at locations where she socialized with friends, and making threatening phone calls to her apartment. When Maria became pregnant with George's child and began making plans to marry him, Bradley's obsession had evolved into homicidal rage directed at the man who possessed what Bradley felt he deserved. Bradley's psychological profile, developed through interviews with people who had known him during the 1980s and analysis of his behavior patterns over the subsequent decades, revealed a man whose capacity for violence had been shaped by childhood abuse, social isolation, and an inability to form normal relationships with women. His crimes against the Mitchell brothers represented a pattern of eliminating perceived rivals for relationships or resources that he coveted but couldn't obtain through legitimate means. The equipment sabotage that George had described in his letters was Bradley's attempt to create dangerous situations that might result in George's accidental death, allowing Bradley to eliminate his romantic rival without appearing to be involved in the crime. When the sabotage failed to produce the desired result, Bradley had resorted to direct violence, attacking George with a tire iron while he was working alone in a remote section of the farm and then staging the scene to make the murder appear to be a tractor rollover. Bradley's ability to maintain his secret for 33 years while continuing to live in the same community where he had committed murder demonstrated a level of psychological compartmentalization that impressed even experienced criminal profilers. He had attended George's funeral, offered condolences to the Mitchell family, and even worked occasionally for Harold during busy seasons, all while knowing that he was responsible for the tragedy that had shaped their lives. The investigation into Bradley's activities during the years between George's murder and Harold's death revealed a pattern of violence against women that had escalated over time but had never been connected to a single perpetrator due to the geographic spread of his crimes and the different law enforcement jurisdictions involved. Bradley had moved frequently during the 1990s and 2000s, working temporary jobs in agricultural communities across Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, leaving behind a trail of assaults, thefts, and suspicious accidents that had never been thoroughly investigated. The cold case review prompted by George's murder investigation identified at least 6 other incidents in which Bradley might have been involved, including 2 suspicious deaths that had been classified as accidents and 4 sexual assaults that had never been solved. The pattern of Bradley's movement between agricultural communities had provided him with access to isolated victims and opportunities to commit crimes without attracting the attention of law enforcement agencies that rarely coordinated investigations across state lines. Maria Santos, now 58 years old and living in Denver with her adult children, provided crucial testimony about Bradley's stalking behavior and violent threats during the summer of 1985. She had never reported Bradley's harassment to police because she feared that involving law enforcement would expose her relationship with George and create additional problems for a family that was already under pressure from George's parents' disapproval of their relationship. Maria's testimony revealed the extent of Bradley's obsession with her, including incidents where he had broken into her apartment, left threatening notes in her car, and followed her to work shifts at the truck stop where she was employed. The harassment had escalated to physical confrontation on at least 2 occasions. Incidents that Maria had hidden from George because she feared he might do something that would put him in danger. The revelation that Bradley had been systematically terrorizing both George and Maria during the summer of 1985 provided additional context for George's increasingly desperate attempts to find solutions to the problems that were threatening his happiness and safety. George had been dealing not just with family disapproval and financial pressures but also with a stalker whose behavior was escalating toward violence in ways that George couldn't fully understand or predict. Maria's son Michael, now 33 years old, learned for the first time that George Mitchell was his biological father and that Bradley was responsible for murdering the man who had been planning to become his stepfather. The revelation created complex emotions for Michael, who had grown up believing that his father was unknown and who now faced the reality that his existence had inadvertently contributed to a murder that had destroyed two families. Michael's reaction to learning about his connection to the Mitchell family and to Bradley's crimes reflected the complicated emotions that arise when family secrets spanning decades are finally revealed. He expressed gratitude for finally knowing the truth about his parentage while struggling with guilt over his role, however unintentional, in motivating the violence that had claimed George's life and eventually led to Harold's murder as well. The trial of Tom Bradley for George Mitchell's murder began in March 2019, 5 months after his conviction for Harold's death. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA, forensic pathology, witness testimony, and Bradley's own confession once he realized that the physical evidence made denial impossible. The prosecution demonstrated that Bradley had spent 33 years successfully concealing one murder while planning another, making him one of the most patient and calculating killers in Kansas history. Bradley's confession revealed details about both murders that only the perpetrator could have known, including his method of accessing the Mitchell farm without being detected, his knowledge of George and Harold's work routines, and his ability to manipulate physical evidence to make murders appear to be accidents. The confession also revealed Bradley's continuing obsession with Maria Santos and his rage over the relationship that had motivated his first murder. The courtroom testimony revealed the full extent of Bradley's deception over more than 3 decades, during which he had maintained friendly relationships with members of the Mitchell family while knowing that he had destroyed their lives through calculated violence. The psychological evaluation conducted during Bradley's trial painted a picture of a man whose capacity for violence had been shaped by childhood abuse, social isolation, and an inability to form normal relationships with women. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychiatrist who examined Bradley, testified that his crimes represented a pattern of eliminating men who possessed relationships he coveted, suggesting that other unsolved cases might be connected to his activities over the past 4 decades. The evaluation revealed Bradley's complete lack of empathy for his victims and their families, combined with a grandiose sense of entitlement that had justified decades of violence and deception in his own mind. The impact on the Mitchell family was devastating in ways that went beyond the additional grief of learning that George's death had been murder rather than accident. Martha Mitchell faced the realization that she had been married for 28 years to a man whose brother had been killed by the same person who would eventually kill her husband. The knowledge that Bradley had been present in their lives, attending family gatherings and community events, while carrying the secret of George's murder created a sense of violation that was almost unbearable. The broader community of Millerville struggled to process the revelation that Tom Bradley had been living among them for over 3 decades while concealing not 1 but 2 murders of beloved community members. The man they had known as a helpful neighbor and reliable worker had actually been a calculating killer who had destroyed the Mitchell family through a campaign of violence that had lasted longer than most people's careers. The financial implications of George's murder were also significant, as the insurance company that had paid the accidental death benefit in 1985 initiated legal proceedings to recover the settlement based on the new evidence that George's death had been intentional rather than accidental. The Mitchell family faced the possibility of having to repay money that had been used to improve the farm and support the family during the difficult years following George's death. Detective Rodriguez's final report on the George Mitchell case highlighted how advances in forensic science and DNA analysis had made it possible to solve crimes that would have remained mysteries under the investigative capabilities available in the 1980s. The case also demonstrated how patterns of violence could extend across decades, with perpetrators maintaining normal lives while harboring secrets that connected them to multiple crimes. The sentencing hearing for Tom Bradley's conviction in George Mitchell's murder took place in September 2019, exactly 34 years after George's death. Bradley received a second life sentence without possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend his remaining years in prison for both murders. The judge's remarks emphasized that Bradley's ability to conceal his crimes for decades while continuing to victimize the Mitchell family represented a level of evil that demanded the maximum punishment available under Kansas law. Martha Mitchell's victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing provided a powerful testimony about the long-term effects of violence that extends across generations. She described 34 years of believing that George's death had been a tragic accident, only to learn that her family had been targeted by a predator who had manipulated their grief and trauma while planning additional violence against the people they loved. The resolution of George Mitchell's case provided closure for questions that had haunted the Mitchell family for over 3 decades. But it also raised new concerns about other unsolved cases that might be connected to Tom Bradley's activities during the years when he had been free to commit additional crimes. Law enforcement agencies across the Midwest began reviewing cold cases involving suspicious accidents and missing persons that might be linked to Bradley's known movements and employment history. The memorial service for George Mitchell, held 34 years after his death, drew hundreds of mourners who came to honor the memory of a young man whose life had been cut short by senseless violence and whose death had been disguised as an accident for over 3 decades. The service provided an opportunity for the community to finally acknowledge George's murder and express the grief that had been complicated by years of believing his death was accidental. Maria Santos attended the memorial service with her son Michael, meeting Martha Mitchell for the first time and sharing memories of George that helped his family understand the relationship that had motivated his murder. The meeting between the two women who had loved George Mitchell created a connection that helped both families begin the process of healing from trauma that had shaped their lives for decades. The George Mitchell case became a teaching example for law enforcement agencies about the importance of thoroughly investigating deaths that appear to be accidents, especially in cases where the victim had reported threats or suspicious activities before their death. The case also demonstrated how modern forensic techniques could provide justice for crimes that had been concealed by the limited investigative capabilities of earlier eras. As this investigation into how one killer destroyed the Mitchell family across 33 years comes to a close, it serves as a reminder that some crimes are patient, calculated enterprises that span decades rather than moments. Tom Bradley's ability to murder George Mitchell in 1985 and then murder Harold Mitchell in 2018 while maintaining the appearance of a normal community member demonstrates how effectively evil can hide among us, waiting for opportunities to strike again. If you've been following this investigation into how a family tragedy that seemed to be resolved actually concealed an even deeper pattern of violence, we want to hear your thoughts about how communities can better protect themselves from predators who use their knowledge of local routines and relationships to plan and conceal murders. Share your theories in the comments below. Subscribe to stay updated on cases where the truth about historical crimes emerges decades after they were committed, and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we explore the complex investigations that prove justice can prevail even when evil has been hiding in plain sight for generations.